Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're safe, sound, and of course, healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of discussions of issues critically important to America and to the world. Today's subject, ending America's forever wars, couldn't be more timely. The Defense Department recently announced troop withdrawals by January 15th that are supposed to reduce U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan to roughly 2,500 each from their one-time highs of 170,000 and 100,000 respectively. And the title of this session, America's Forever Wars, is there really a way out, may sound somewhat pejorative, but one can be forgiven for thinking, given the fact that these are the two longest wars in American history. And now a fourth administration is soon to wrestle with the problem, that it's a legitimate question to ask. Although clearly you could argue that the focus has shifted some time ago from the conventional sense of when to that of when can we leave and what will we leave behind. And the emphasis on the leaving is now tethered to a recent agreement concluded this year under U.S. auspices between representatives of the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan. As for the what will be left behind, that's less certain to say the least. U.S. withdrawal, according to the agreement, is presumably conditional on whether the Taliban is making good on its commitments to reduce violence, fight terror, and engage in good faith intra-Afghan negotiations. Iraq presents a different situation in the sense that there may be no formal timetable or formal pressures. Yet the decision by the Trump administration to roughly halve the number of U.S. forces doesn't seem to be linked to any of that, but to a sort of rush for the exits for reasons of politics, legacy, perhaps even the personal vanity of the president. Opinions on whether to leave under what condition vary greatly, from those reflected in the recent Washington Post op-ed by members of the Congressional Bipartisan Afghanistan Study Group, who argue, and I'm quoting here, an abrupt withdrawal of U.S. troops, as is now being contemplated by the Trump administration, would undermine the fragile but potentially transformational peace process. It would embolden the Taliban, destabilize the Kabul government, and allow terrorist groups to reconsolidate. A civil war could result, provoking a wider regional conflict and an inevitable humanitarian and migration crisis. Then we have the views of a Marine captain who served in Afghanistan, who wrote recently in the New York Times that in his view, these wars are lost. And though he feels still a personal obligation to leave the Afghan and Iraqi people with a chance to live in peace, his conclusion is that that commitment will not be fulfilled, and that these wars will enter the history books not only as defeats for the United States, but stains on America's national honor, as sort of relearning the lessons of Vietnam. So where does this leave us? Well, it leaves me with more questions, as usual, than I have answers for. What are U.S. vital interests in these conflicts as opposed to the discretionary ones? What's an acceptable end state for the U.S. in each arena? Is the primary goal counterterrorism or internal political stability and reform? Can you separate one from the other? And is there an outcome that's achievable that can justify the sacrifices made, or are we aiming for what some have called a good enough outcome? Neighbors and the international community play a role in a settlement. How is that going to play out? And of course, how should the incoming Biden administration approach the issue? Fortunately, and I say this on every Carnegie Connects, I don't have to answer these questions, but we have three extraordinary and exceptional panelists who will address them. General David H. Petraeus, U.S. Army retired, is a partner and chairman of KKR Global Institute, which he established in May 2013. Prior to founding KKR, General Petraeus served for over 37 years in the U.S. military, ending his career with 6 consecutive commands, 5 of which were in combat, serving as director of the Central Intelligence Agency from 2011 to 2012. Andrew Bacevich is president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and Professor Emeritus of History and International Relations at Boston University. I wish he would have allowed me to mention at least one of his books. And Dr. Francis C. Brown, last but definitely not least, Senior Fellow with Carnegie's Democracy, Conflict, and Governance Program, a valued colleague of mine who previously worked at the White House, USAID, and in several non-governmental organizations. She writes on conflict governance and U.S. foreign policy. Format, brief observation by each, an annoying round of questions from me, and then questions from our audience. So with that, Andrew, Andy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for including me in this event. I should have asked you to mention a book, but I'm glad you mentioned the Quincy Institute. I'm sort of here with my Quincy Institute hat on. I'll give a 10-second commercial. If people watching this don't know what we're about, check us out on our website, okay? Aaron asked us to make brief opening remarks. Let me dive right into mine. It's my judgment that the American military project in the greater Middle East has failed. And that failure is definitive and it's irrevocable. And I think it's time for us as a nation to acknowledge that failure and to terminate the entire undertaking because we have more pressing national security priorities. The project I'm referring to began in January 1980 when the Carter Doctrine identified the Persian Gulf as a vital U.S. national security interest. Underlying the Carter Doctrine were two assumptions. First, that the American way of life depended on access to Persian Gulf oil. Second, that the Soviet incursion into Afghanistan just a month prior positioned the USSR to pose a direct threat to the Gulf. Events since have exposed both of those assumptions as wildly wrong. Regardless, promulgation of the Carter Doctrine set in motion the militarization of U.S. policy in the Gulf, and the Pentagon began gearing up to intervene in the region. And armed interventions came, small or brief at first, then after 9/11 on a larger scale and of a greater duration. The nominal aim of the global war on terrorism has evolved over time. Pursuant to what George W. Bush called his freedom agenda, it began as an effort to liberate the oppressed, spread the blessings of liberty, so we were told anyway. The freedom agenda met its demise at Abu Ghraib prison when revelations of U.S. troops grotesquely abusing Iraqis for their own amusement demolished our pretension. Since then, U.S. war aims have become increasingly difficult to identify with precision. Minimally, we've sought to deny sanctuaries to terrorists intent on targeting the United States. More ambitiously, we've engaged in nation-building exercises aimed at creating political legitimacy and building local security forces. Progress toward these goals has been slow at best, despite the prodigious expenditure of resources. Two such wars, the ones that Aaron mentioned, in particular, have absorbed our attention. The site of the Afghanistan War, longest in our nation's history, is an impoverished, landlocked nation. In substantive importance to the United States, Afghanistan ranks on a par with Uruguay. Yet over the past 19 years, we have spent over $1 trillion there, while losing over 2,300 U.S. troops with another 10,000 wounded, and the results achieved have been disappointing. The second primary 9/11 contingency is centered on Iraq. Please recall that the Iraqi regime played no role whatsoever in the 9/11 conspiracy. Indeed, the United States targeted Iraq for reasons that had little to do with 9/11. Iraq was to provide a venue for a larger strategy of regional transformation. The strategy was a fanciful one and never made it past Baghdad. One might argue that Iraq is more important to the United States than is Uruguay. After all, Iraq has oil, yet so do we, and lots of it. Consider the double irony here. Back in 1980, the perception that U.S. domestic reserves were dwindling invested the Persian Gulf with apparent strategic importance. Today, the United States is the #1 producer of oil on the planet. Meanwhile, oil has become as much a curse as a blessing. Reining in climate change requires a major reduction in our reliance on fossil fuels. Since 2003, over 4,400 U.S. troops have died in Iraq, with 32,000 wounded. By the time the last bill is paid, the Iraq War will have cost the American taxpayer somewhere in the range of $4 to $5 trillion. Again, the results have been disappointing, to put it mildly. Just imagine where we would be today if all that money had been invested in renewable energy. It's enough to make one weep. I do not doubt that the United States needs to keep a wary eye on terrorists. I reject entirely the notion that open-ended war is a proper response to terrorism. We have much more immediate concerns to worry about. The coronavirus pandemic is one. Climate change is a second. The shifting distribution of power in East Asia is a third. The angry divisions afflicting our beloved country at home are a fourth. So the time to end the folly of needless and pointless war is now. Thank you.
Andy, thank you. Sharply focused, leaves no doubt where you stand. I would only make a general comment that I think probably applies now more than ever. Even though I do believe in a robust American role in the world, I don't think I can identify a single foreign policy problem right now that is more threatening, more dangerous, and more consequential to the well-being and security of the United States than the 4 or 5 interlocked crises that we now face at home. Frances, let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much. And it's a real honor and pleasure to be on this panel this morning. I want to focus in more specifically on the Afghanistan war and what we on the US side are trying to achieve, what we've learned, if anything, and a little bit on where we go from here. I agree fully that I think any incoming Biden administration policymaker is going to need to think very long and hard about what is our relative interest in Afghanistan versus the other really pressing national security threats, very broadly defined, that are afflicting the US right now. So absolutely, the COVID crisis now kills more Americans per week than September 11th did. The tremendous economic crisis that has real human consequences, and of course, climate change, which is an existential threat for our globe. So I think the Biden administration is going to look at Afghanistan rightly as a priority that coexists along with a lot of other priorities and needs to be adjudicated accordingly. And given that, I think it's crystal clear in my mind that Afghanistan cannot command the amount of dollars or policymaker attention or American lives that it commanded perhaps 10 years ago in the heyday of the so-called surge. It simply cannot. On the other hand, I actually think one thing we've learned in regards to Afghanistan is that more US attention, more US resources, more US troops doesn't actually bring about a proportionally better outcome when it comes to this war and our results in it. 10 years ago, in the heyday of the surge, this is obviously a time period General Petraeus knows very well, we had an abundance of US troops, an abundance of US money. I was serving as a civilian downrange. I had an abundance of bosses and an abundance of chains of command. We were overwhelming the country with attention. We also had an abundance of White House National Security Council meetings and strategic plans, all focused on Afghanistan. And I think we have to be honest that all of that attention did not actually achieve the outcomes we wanted. I see this in a few different ways, why we didn't actually get the outcome we wanted when we spent this much attention and resources on Afghanistan. First of all, we devoted all these military resources to the country, and we did make some fast military gains on the ground, but we were never able to convert that progress over to progress on the political side, setting up legitimate, accountable government or fostering it on the Afghan side. Second, we successfully used our military resources to make impressive localized gains. You may recall hearing a lot about provinces like Helmand and Kandahar 10 years ago and specific districts in there. And there were some impressive temporary gains in these areas, but that has never transferred into broader systemic progress in Afghanistan. The so-called ink blot never actually spread all that far. The bottom-up progress unfortunately didn't trickle up, in my view. Third of all, we had this idea that our strategy just needed to help connect the Afghan people to the Afghan government, and that once that connection was in place, things would improve. We heard a lot of this idea that the insurgency began where the road ended. I think looking back, we have to be honest that that wasn't the case. When the Afghan government was viewed by many of its citizens as corrupt and extortive and predatory, connecting the people to the Afghan government often proved to be destabilizing. And then finally, I think we need to be clear-eyed that the amount of resources we flooded into the country in some ways enabled Afghan corruption or other actors' corruption on the ground, fueled a war economy. I know this is something General Petraeus was seized with as well, but in essence, it was still a very bad externality of our engagement there. So in short, we cannot spend this much or anywhere near these amounts of resource or time on the country, and I think the effects were perverse. So zooming back to today and where I think we go from here, I think the good news is that using less attention and less resources may actually have better prospects to salvage a less bad outcome. So the important question in my mind is, how do we utilize the leverage we've got to help bring about better results for the Afghan people and for the United States? How do we strategically use the leverage that is underpinned by our diplomatic engagement, by our potential economic assistance, by our work with international partners and regional neighbors, and with our diplomatic leadership, potentially underpinned by a small complement of troops? How do we marshal all of that to salvage a better outcome? We can talk more about that in the question and answer, about the potential opportunities of a peace deal among the Afghan governments, the Afghan Taliban opposition, and other actors. The deal that Aaron mentioned in the intro is specifically between the US and the Taliban. It's not an overall Afghan peace deal. So I look forward to talking more about that in the discussion about what opportunities might exist. The spoiler is all of the outcomes here are suboptimal as well. There's not going to be a perfect peace deal that ends the score as well, but I do think there's a lot that a new Biden administration can do on this front, and I look forward to talking more about that.
Francis, thank you. A lot of ground covered. A terrific presentation. General Petraeus, it's an honor to have you here. I'm turning it over to you now.
Oh, the honor's mine. It's great to be with you, Aaron. Thanks. And I'll be happy to revisit what Francis just covered, except that I have other points, but I'd be happy to go over what the objectives were that we sought to achieve in Afghanistan during the surge and what we did and did not achieve. And she makes some very valid points, but I would also counter that the halting of the momentum of the Taliban, the reversing of it in very key locations, the accelerated buildup of Afghan security forces, and the development of some of the institutions that we needed, albeit always very far from perfect, did enable us to reduce forces over time and transition tasks to the Afghan security forces. But what I wanted to do is make a couple of broader points, if I could. The first of which is that no one wants to see endless wars end more than those who have fought them and their families who know the sacrifices that these wars entailed. But we need to distinguish between truly ending an endless war in a durable and responsible way and just ending our involvement in endless wars, which is more often what we're really actually talking about. And ending our involvement often means that the war will continue in our absence, despite having what may be significant continuing interests in those countries. In Afghanistan, for example, we invaded to eliminate a sanctuary that the Al-Qaeda had during Taliban rule, in which the 9/11 attacks were conceived, they were planned, and where the initial training of the attackers was conducted. And of course, we've stayed the most principal objective that we have sought to achieve in staying, albeit while having more expansive activities at various times for what I would contend were reasonable reasons, although again, as Francis notes, the overwhelming of the country with resources had some very unintended consequences as well that were not welcome. But again, we have stayed to keep Al-Qaeda and now, unfortunately, the Islamic State Khorasan group from reestablishing a sanctuary in eastern Afghanistan, which may not pose the same threat that certainly posed under the Taliban, but which continues to be, I would contend, a fairly important objective, worthy of some commitment of resources. And also, we should note that Afghanistan still is the platform from which we conduct the regional counterterrorism campaign from time to time, which is not a trivial endeavor either, given that al-Qaeda's senior leadership, whoever may be the senior leader now, is presumably still in North Waziristan or somewhere in the federally administered tribal areas, along with a number of other groups, leaders that wish us ill. So these are all wars, though, that at this point, and I'm talking now about Iraq, Afghanistan, we should expand it to include Syria, Somalia, North Africa. These are wars that, regardless of how and why they began, are wars now with Islamist extremists in various ways. And that's the reality of today. Again, even as you can certainly revisit and ask whether we should or should not have started some of these wars or engaged in them. But you asked about lessons learned, and I think that's where there is some worthy discussion, because from my perspective, I think we should have learned 5 lessons from the past 20 years of wars with Islamist extremists. The first is that Islamist extremists will exploit ungoverned spaces in the Muslim world. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when and how serious is it. The second is that you actually have to do something about it in many of the cases. You cannot watch this until it goes away. Las Vegas rules don't apply in these areas. What happens there doesn't stay there. Rather, it tends to spew violence, extremism, instability, and refugees way beyond the region. In the case of a geopolitical Chernobyl like Syria, all the way into Western Europe, where we were almost compelled to respond to the Islamic State for what it was doing in that regard, establishing a caliphate in Iraq and Syria, and at one point actually threatening the outskirts of Baghdad. The third is that generally the U.S., because of this extraordinary predominance of military capability, especially now in the capabilities that are most useful in fighting these wars, the way we have now been able to evolve in fighting them, will need to lead, but it should be a coalition, and that coalition should include Muslim countries for whom these wars are often existential in nature, far more than they certainly are for us. The fourth is that we should have learned by now that you cannot counter terrorists with just counter-terrorist force operations. You can't just drone strike or Delta Force raid your way out of these problems. You can certainly disrupt extremist groups, and if that's all that you can do, then that is what you do. But you have to understand that what you are doing is disrupting, not ending the problem, nor ending the conditions that have given rise to that problem or enabled extremists again to exploit local circumstances. So you need a comprehensive approach, but what we have learned is how to enable host nation forces so that they are the ones that are carrying out the frontline fighting. They're the ones who are carrying out the local reconciliation, reestablishment of basic services, repair of damaged infrastructure, and on and on. All of the elements of a civil military approach that we had to do, I would contend, in the surge in Iraq, because the country was on the verge of a Sunni Shia civil war. But again, that we've also learned we don't want to do, if at all possible, we want the host nation forces to do. And we have figured out how to do that, given the extraordinary constellation of drones, the abilities that we have in fusion of intelligence, and the advise and assist elements that we have created. So you have to have a comprehensive approach. The fifth lesson is that this is a challenge of a generation, not a decade, much less a few years. And it requires, therefore, a sustained commitment. A sustained commitment means you are at it for as long as you need to, but sustainability cautions that it has to be as efficient and as cost effective as is absolutely possible when it comes to the two most important elements of sustainability from our perspective, and that is the expenditure of our blood and our treasure. And frankly, I think it is more than affordable for the United States, even in an era when we absolutely need to shift our focus, rebalance to Asia that was begun under the previous administration, continued under this one, and will clearly continue under the next one. That has to be absolutely the main effort in an era of renewed great power rivalries and so forth. But having 5,000 or so troops in Afghanistan, a few thousand in Iraq to assist Iraqi security forces, who at the end of the day did do the fighting on the front lines to eliminate the ISIS as an army and its caliphate, albeit still there as insurgents and terrorist groups, a few thousand or a couple thousand, really, it's less than 2,000 now in Syria, and sprinkles of others elsewhere, is more than affordable for a superpower like the United States, which inevitably has to keep a lot of plate spinning, albeit the most important plate from a foreign policy perspective. And I acknowledge absolutely what Andrew and Francis have noted about the importance of combating the challenges that we have at home, not the least of which is the pandemic and the economic downturn associated with that, years of inadequate investment in infrastructure, education, comprehensive energy, immigration reform, you name it, addressing climate change and so forth. But again, modest commitments of forces that enable us to continue to deal with the extremist threat and to prevent it from becoming what it can, as we have seen where we don't take action, is, I think, very doable for the United States, and actually I would say is an imperative. So again, let's be very clear when we talk about whether we are ending endless wars or we are ending our involvement in them, and what is the consequence potentially of ending our involvement before the endless war has actually ended itself. And finally, I'd note that the effort in Afghanistan, I have enormous admiration for Ambassador Khalilzad. I worked with him in both of the countries at various times. But at the end of the day, after years to get a US Taliban agreement, which was largely geared to Taliban objectives to get their prisoners out of detention and us to reduce our forces or leave the country, we have now progressed to the point where the negotiations are between the Taliban and a delegation of Afghans, Taliban still not recognizing the elected government, and they have just now agreed, finally, after months of wrangling, to actually talk about what they're going to talk about, to discuss the agenda for what they will discuss. And I see no prospect, especially given that the Taliban is achieving its objectives without even having to give up anything, i.e. we are reducing our forces without gaining anything from them in return. I see no prospect that the Taliban will agree to what I would think would be a durable end to the war between the Taliban and the other insurgent groups and extremists and Afghan forces.
General Petraeus, thank you. Thoughtful and probing, a lot to unpack. I want to start with Afghanistan and then move to Iraq, but I want to ask all of you a fundamental question. I struggled throughout most of my government career and even now with trying to identify the difference between a vital American national interest and a discretionary one. And governing is about choosing, whether it's at home or abroad. It's setting priorities. FDR reportedly said about Lincoln that he died a very sad man because he couldn't have everything, and Lincoln was our undeniably greatest president. Couldn't have everything. So let me ask a general question as pertains first to Afghanistan. How would you define America's vital interests in Afghanistan as opposed to the discretionary ones? Getting away from the question of what's feasible as opposed to what's desirable. What are our vital interests there? And General Petraeus, let me start with you. Just succinct summary of what in your judgment they are. Interests that an American president would be vital means vital to the security and prosperity of the United States, presumably.
Well, there's an implication in the question that you should only do something if there is a vital interest. And the truth is that we take actions around the world and frankly at home when there are important interests and not just vital interests. I mean, we could get into the definitional of what is a vital interest and should you do anything where there's not a vital interest? I think it's arguable whether or not keeping al-Qaeda from reestablishing a sanctuary in eastern Afghanistan, as it has sought to do repeatedly, as Francis will recall from even when we were in the era of the surge, and now the Islamic State wants to do the same thing. Now, is this a vital interest? Probably not. I mean, again, depending on your definition of vital, if it is something that really threatens the very national existence, probably not. But it is an important interest of our country, I think. There are other interests there as well. Again, I don't think we want to see a meltdown of a country that would once again spew violence, extremism, instability, and a tsunami of refugees, not just into neighboring countries, but all the way into, again, Western Europe, which has been the destination of a lot of the refugees from Afghanistan, certainly from Syria, millions of them, 1 million alone in Germany, and others from North Africa, Iraq, and other places. So again, this is rather than get into a definitional interest, are there important interests that we have in Afghanistan? Yep, I think there are. How much do they warrant in terms of, again, the sustained commitment? That's the bigger issue. And how low can you go is going to be the other question.
Right.
So that you have a sustainable commitment. The truth is that Americans, I don't think, really care that we have forces deployed overseas. If we did, we would have long since brought home the 30,000 that are actually deployed on Japanese soil, the well over 40,000 that we've had in South Korea for decades since the armistice or whatever that ended that war as we knew it, tens of thousands that were in Europe, 250,000 when then Colonel Bacevich was a G3 for a division and then a regimental commander, as I recall. That's not to say that you should perpetuate these forever, but the point is that I don't think that the issue for Americans is that you have forces deployed overseas if there's some reason and reasonable interest that they are safeguarding. The question really is, what is the cost? And the most important cost, needless to say, is that in blood, and the next one is in treasure. And as both noted previously, the expenses of the Iraq War in particular were astronomical, and Afghanistan was very, very substantial as well.
You could argue, of course, that Japan and South Korea and even Germany constitute different situations.
I absolutely would. But again, there are interests there.
No, agreed.
And those were vital interests, I would contend, certainly in the days of the Cold War. There still arguably is a vital interest, again, depending on your definition of that. And absolutely, the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific is the region of focus. The future is Asian. And we do have an era of renewed great power rivalries.
Andrew, let me ask you the same question. I think we may have lost your audio.
I think you're on mute, Ann.
I agree with General Petraeus that, trying to distinguish between the vital interest, the important interest, ends up being a long conversation that doesn't get us anywhere. I think the point that I would like to offer is how we go about trying to satisfy those interests, however we might categorize them. And in my judgment, a fundamental error that permeates our policy in the Middle East, dating from the Carter Doctrine, is this emphasis on using military power. The conviction that a U.S. military presence in the region, just the presence, is going to contribute to stability. It seems to me that actual events tell us just the contrary. The conviction that the commitment of U.S. combat forces to fight in Afghanistan and Iraq is going to bring about stability has been disproven. And therefore, it seems to me that rather than disagreeing as to how important interests in these places might be, we got to hone in on whether or not our approach to satisfying those interests has been counterproductive, and I believe it has. It is the emphasis on military power and the misuse of military power that has made matters worse. And unless we recognize that, it'll be very difficult for us to come to a more prudent and realistic understanding of what our great military power can do, can't do, where it should be used, and where it should not be used.
You know, Andy, you made the point about the militarization of U.S. foreign policy, and implicit in your question is that you'd like to see, presumably, and correct me if I'm wrong here, all U.S. military forces withdrawn, not just from Iraq and Afghanistan, from the Middle East. I want to come back to that point. But Francis, I want to give you a chance to answer the question. We're not going to distinguish between vital and discretionary, and we use the notion of important interests that are worth protecting and how best to protect them. How would you identify U.S. core interests, important interests in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think orders of magnitude really matter here and proportions really matter. We have heard for 20 years that prevention of terrorism is a vital national interest, a key national interest. But there's also a qualitative difference between a 40% of a terrorist attack that kills 100,000 Americans versus a 1% chance of a terrorist attack that kills 4 Americans. So I can't, without reading the intelligence on any of these specific places, tell you what, you know, where the risks fall. So I think we need to be really nuanced when we talk about particularly terrorism as a risk. I also can't tell you without reading the intelligence what other ways we might have to address terrorist risk from particular places. I think General Petraeus has more experience on that. So I'm not going to get into the basketing of vital versus important without talking about orders of magnitude. Our other interests in Afghanistan include an Afghanistan that can stand on its own, control its own territory, or accept international help effectively to do so. We also often talk about preserving the gains that have been won over the last 20 years, particularly in terms of Afghan women's rights. These are important interests, you know, and then we get into the question of where do they fall on the relative prioritization? What I would also say is that orders of magnitude matter when we're talking about resources. Again, to General Petraeus's point, I think there is a qualitative difference between a few thousand or a few hundred troops in Syria versus tens of thousands of troops elsewhere. And I think we need to be really precise about that when we're thinking about what we on the US are willing to engage in these areas. I think precision is important. A lot of these conversations on the forever war end up being hair splitting on troop levels. I would love to see as much discussion and hair splitting on diplomatic levels, diplomatic bandwidth, diplomatic resourcing. Just on the Afghanistan example, those who may remember Ambassador Richard Holbrooke and his massive team working on the Afghanistan file, compare that now to the small team that Special Envoy Khalilzad has working on the file. It's just a really different game. And I think we will never actually effectively push forward diplomatic solutions, political solutions on these areas until we get as serious about staffing for success on the civilian side, on the diplomatic side, as we do on the military side.
I mean, the counterterrorism argument is clearly.
Can I build on that?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Because first of all, I think Francis is absolutely right to imply at least that the risk to our homeland from terrorists who are overseas is actually dramatically reduced. The threat that was so significant from the Islamic State, in truth, was not a threat against our homeland. It was actually a threat, first of all, within Iraq and Syria, and then that was just causing the most significant domestic political populism, if you will, in Western Europe, our allies of NATO, that they had had since the end of the Cold War. And I'd condemn, and there was also a very real humanitarian disaster in the making with the Yazidis in Western Nainawa province, the Kurds and so forth. And again, had we not intervened gone back into Iraq, it is very likely that would have continued perhaps all the way to the gates of Erbil and certainly further toward Baghdad. So I think it is important to recognize. I mean, I am not one who has believed for quite a long time that the reestablishment of an al-Qaeda sanctuary in eastern Afghanistan or an Islamic State sanctuary there implies that there would be another 9/11 attack. First of all, I don't think those organizations have the capabilities that they had before. And second, I really do believe that intelligence reform and breaking down the stovepipes and a variety of other lessons that we learned and then implemented with organizational architecture and processes changed in the wake of the 9/11 attacks and the 9/11 Commission will indeed allow us to identify that. The truth is, actually, as the FBI director has recently stated, the most significant terrorist threat in the United States is not actually from Islamist extremists, it's from right-wing terrorists in our own country. And the Islamist extremists that have carried out attacks in the US are ones that generally have been self-recruited from watching Anwar al-Awlaki videos or these kinds of things, which should be taken down and finally have been by and large from YouTube and others. So again, I think that's a very important distinction. That does not mean, though, that you shouldn't still be very concerned about the prospect of, again, an al-Qaeda sanctuary or an Islamic State sanctuary and the effects that that could have. Nor, as Francis pointed out, again, there have been extraordinary advances, especially for girls and who can go to school and women in Afghanistan. And, you know, the idea of the soccer fields in Baghdad once again being execution fields, as the Taliban used them, is not a particularly desirable future. So again, in my view, it does come down to, again, how can you have a sustained commitment? And I just want to emphasize the point that Francis made, that we have never had, even in the heyday, even when Richard Holbrooke was the AFPAC envoy and the attention was on Afghanistan, it was the good war again, and all the rest of this, as the term was during the campaign, the war of necessity, there were never enough civilian resources. We actually had to do provincial reconstruction teams in Afghanistan, largely with uniformed military. There were some heroes. Francis was one of a lot of them, but certainly never enough. And if your only solution is constantly the military, the same thing we had to do in Iraq. We had to call up Army reservists, put them in civilian clothes, and make them parts of provincial reconstruction teams. Secretary Gates' recent book, I think, establishes that once again, he having railed about this back when he was the Secretary of Defense, and it's way beyond state and AID and the development experts. It's a lot of other areas of expertise that you really need, and which you need over a sustained period of time, unfortunately, because it takes that amount of time to build institutions.
Right.
And frankly, if the commitment is a bit uncertain, that doesn't exactly help. So whether you intend to draw down or not, in the back of your mind, as we knew we had to in Iraq at the end of the surge, I knew there were no more forces. I would not even tell Congress that we were going to do that. It was going to be conditions-based, because I don't want the enemy to think that we do have to go home. And so I have long felt that it was not a wise move to announce the drawdown date in the same speech at which you announced the buildup when it came to Afghanistan. Again, if you are going to try to negotiate from a position of strength, the enemy should think at least that you are willing to sustain a commitment, and that enemy will have to deal with you over a sustained period of time. The question is, how can it be sustainable in blood and treasure at a time when we have so many needs elsewhere?
All of you have indicated to one extent or another that we may well need a new definition of Homeland Security. I mean, clearly watching events over the last year, when the threat to the Republic came, it came not in the form of a Sunni jihadi terror attack. It came in the form of a virus, which has done more damage and destruction to the Republic, than any terrorist attack, clearly, including 9/11. And that's a point well taken. This issue, before we move to Iraq, and I mean, there's so much here, we could have 3 sessions. I want to ask all of you, because I think we're somehow skirting the issue. What is my words here, not yours, a good enough agreement that would allow the United States to satisfy its important, perhaps its vital interests in Afghanistan? What's a good enough agreement? Or Andy hasn't said this, but maybe he will. Should we simply decide that we've been there 18, 19 years, it's going to take years to negotiate an intra-Afghan accord to stabilize the country, if it's even possible? So what is a good enough agreement? Andy, let me start with you.
Well, a good enough agreement is one that satisfies our basic interests and does minimal damage to the Afghan people. So much of the conversation seems to assume that either we must continue the military enterprise or we wash our hands, we do nothing, we walk away. And, catastrophe then ensues. I would reject that sort of analysis. I think there are probably a number of things that we could do. I'll give you one example. The issue of women's rights in Afghanistan has been raised. Okay, we leave. If that creates an opportunity for the Taliban to regain power, what can we do? Well, we can vastly increase the availability of immigration opportunities by Afghans into the United States. The ones who don't want to live there can come to America. It's not necessary for us to maintain U.S. forces in perpetuity in order to ensure that the advances made by Afghan women are completely turned back. I think that we have not talked about, could well talk about, the interests of other powers in the region who may well not wish to see Afghan turn into an anarchic state, who may wish to see how they can exert themselves in order to maintain stability in the wake of a U.S. military withdrawal. So bottom line is it's not either keep U.S. forces there for a generation or watch the whole thing fall apart.
By January 15th, assuming the drawdown continues, we may have 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. What, just briefly, and you have the power to sum these things up very sharply, what would you do about the remaining American forces in Afghanistan over the course of the next year, 2021?
But I myself,
yes, would you pull them out?
Wish to withdraw them.
Yes.
Because, as I said in my opening remarks, it seems to me we need to acknowledge the failure of this military undertaking that dates back to 1980. Only if we acknowledge the failure is it possible for us as a nation to then come to a more prudent and realistic understanding of what American military power can do and can't do. And when we come to that more realistic understanding, it seems to me, then that opens up opportunities of the kinds of the things that Francis was referring to begin to invest greater resources in diplomacy and the like. But if we sustain the pretense that somehow this undertaking is going to lead to a happy ending, I think all we do is extend the tragedy and to increase the costs that we've already borne.
Yeah. Francis, to you quickly, because I do want to turn to Iraq, primarily from the political side. What would be, in terms of Iraq's neighbors and a coalition for sustainability, what is a good enough agreement? If you could just identify the 2 or 3 elements that you think are necessary.
Yeah, I think when we think about what is a good enough agreement or outcome in Afghanistan, we have to be clear that the choices are between suboptimal and really suboptimal, at least from our perspective, and at least relative to the massive amount of investment that we have staked there over the last almost 20 years. But I do think there's a few things that can make a relatively better agreement possible. One, to the issue on neighbors and the regional context, I do think we need to greatly increase the way we're engaging. Afghanistan's neighbors can be either a partner in trying to bring about a better outcome, or they can be spoilers in this endeavor. And over the last 4 years in particular, we've tended to view the entire globe in terms of great power competition. I think when we view Afghanistan exclusively or primarily through that lens, it actually can lead to some effects that backfire. Russia has been very active on some diplomatic efforts. We can quibble with their methods or their intention, but I think we would be better off engaging or trying to influence those efforts rather than keeping them at a distance. Similarly, Iran, Afghanistan's neighbor, I think we would do much better in Iran's interest. It is more in Iran's interest probably to have a stable, peaceful Afghanistan than to have one particularly at war. So are there ways that we can find productive common ground there and not view everything through the lens of massive pressure on Iran? The other ingredients I would point to on salvaging this better outcome, relatively better outcome, again, empower the diplomats. I commend the Trump administration for naming Ambassador Khalilzad and allowing him to go forward, but I think it was always unclear to what degree he spoke for the president. You may remember President Trump can dramatically sort of rip the rug out from under him at a moment's notice. So we need to have an empowered negotiation. We need to resource the diplomatic side. We've covered that already. I do think we need to use what leverage we have, which is not just troops. It is economic assistance, carrots and sticks on that side. And finally, we need to keep at it. Diplomacy and salvaging a better outcome is not the matter of a dramatic tweet or a dramatic announcement or a dramatic signing ceremony. It is painstaking, long work. It is knocking heads together. General Petraeus mentioned how slowly the Afghan talks have been going thus far. I agree with that, but I actually think that's pretty typical for negotiations to end a war as complex as this. So I think we need to be concerted and persistent in our efforts on the diplomatic side to try to achieve this marginally better outcome.
Thank you. General Petraeus.
I'm all for persistence.
Right.
I would offer that I don't think this has a happy ending. I don't think that's attainable. A happy ending would be the Taliban agree to observe the Constitution, accept all the, again, rights for women and all the other elements that are enshrined in that, and recognize the elected government, and then compete in the process, which has happened with one other group that actually did reconcile and does compete in that matter. It was not one of the major ones, but that did take place. So again, we're not looking for a happy ending. We're just not looking, we're trying to avoid an absolutely catastrophic ending, which is easy to envision if we pull out all of our forces and our air power in particular, which is what the key has been to enabling the Afghan forces when they get into a tough fight, and is not yet built up. And it's going to be very, very difficult to build up in Afghanistan, a country that at best can generate a couple of $1 billion a year in revenue, compared with, say, Iraq, which could generate 100 billion in oil export revenue alone. So very, very different circumstances. We empowered diplomats before. I mean, Richard Holbrooke was empowered in a way that I don't think we've seen in quite some time, had an enormous team. We had also 100,000 troops, US troops on the ground, 50,000 NATO. If there was ever a time when we could have engaged Pakistan, Iran, the Central Asian states, and all the others, it would have been then. We did engage them. I was party to lots and lots of the discussions, of course, as a Central Command commander, then as the commander in Afghanistan, and then as the director of the CIA. And we were let down every single time. The fact is that the Pakistanis have never been willing to actually eliminate the sanctuaries on their territory that exist for the Taliban. There's a reason it's called the Quetta Shura, the capital of that province of Baluchistan, because that's where they are in Pakistan. Outside that, there's a reason why you have another Shura that's named for the Peshawar, and also so forth and so on. We know where the groups are. Occasionally, very occasionally, there's some action against them, usually against the actual extremist Al-Qaeda or now the Islamic State, but very seldom against the others. And then finally, again, ending our involvement before the war really has come to some kind of conclusion could very well likely end up with the Afghan security forces crumbling. Then you see the international organizations go away. That really matters in Afghanistan because the NGOs and international organizations provide a lot of the basic services for the people in a whole host of different ways. And then you're going to see the forces align themselves with different of the warlords, and you're going to have a replay to varying degrees of what took place when the Russians withdrew their support for the regime that was installed when they left the country, and did indeed endure for 2 years until they cut off their final assistance. And that would be a very, very ugly situation. It's all well and good to say we could offer additional visas and so forth. We're talking about millions here. We're not talking about a modest number. And that would be at a time when Americans, unfortunately, in my view, have shown less willingness to take folks from outside, particularly, frankly, from Muslim countries against which we had a ban for part of this administration. Now, there's another administration coming in, but there are still constraints on what that administration will do. And seeing millions of people fleeing into neighboring countries, which already have sizable numbers of refugees, and then eventually into Western Europe and to our country, is not, I don't think, this is not only not a happy ending, this is a pretty disastrous ending. So, so again, that's, I think, how I would look at this at the very least. And again, I'm all for empowering diplomats and persistence. But if you, Francis is right, they pulled the rug out from under Zal by consistently showing that we want to leave. That's not negotiating from a position of strength at all. In fact, the Taliban are basically getting what they wanted without having given up anything, and have certainly not lived up to the hope that they would reduce violence, which is part of the agreement that was reached between the U.S. and the Taliban. The violence is at very high levels, sadly.
This is a key point, and we are kind of in a conundrum. Terry Schultz from NPR wanted to know whether or not our leverage was reduced as a consequence of the withdrawal
of course it
down
is.
to 2,500. But here's my final question. We may go a few minutes over. I hope none of you mind, because I do want to get a question on Iraq in. The withdrawal timeline was a big win for the Taliban, and they insisted on it up front, before even commencing talks in an intra-Afghan setting. And it's unlikely that these Afghan talks can be sustained if that win is not sustained. And and unfortunately, it's likely that if talks may not continue after a full withdrawal. So aren't we more or less bound to maintain a military footprint, given the fact that these talks are going to endure for quite a long time? And that's maybe you don't need to respond. I think, it seems to me, it's very likely that a year from now, we'll be having another Carnegie Connects conversation on the fact that we still maintain, and maybe General Petraeus, the price is worth paying, significant number of troops in Afghanistan. Let me turn to Iraq. The Deputy Prime Minister, Ali Alawi, said, from his point of view, if we go down to 2,500 troops in January, further reductions, that the American military presence is, quote, to use his words, ornamental, unquote. So just from anyone who wants to briefly comment on our objectives in Iraq and the relationship of our military deployment there, let's go ahead with that question. Andrew, I think I may know the answer, your answer, but go ahead.
Yeah, you do. And this relates to Afghanistan as well, I think. So much of our conversation about how the United States should intervene, whether militarily or diplomatically, in the affairs of these countries, assumes that we, as outsiders, are actually better able to determine the fate of these countries than are the people who live there. I think it's worth questioning that assumption. I mean, in many respects, that's the assumption that was at the base of the entire global war on terrorism. That we can figure out what makes these countries work and we can make them work better. Now, the three of us may disagree, but it seems to me that the, using my term, reckless use of military power in Iraq and in Afghanistan actually made things worse, created instability, provided opportunities for Islamist terrorist organizations to take root and to do terrible things. So there is a fundamental question here, I think, about the efficacy of American interference in the affairs of countries on the other side of the world that we don't really understand all that well.
Or those whose problems are beyond our capacity, since it involves leadership, transparency, good governance. And
when I was thinking about this conversation, we all, I think we all have agreed that we have enormous problems in our country today. Once again, we've become aware of the pervasive problem of racism. I think we are increasingly aware of divisions within our country, whether they're between populists and liberals, however we want to talk about it. We've become aware of the extent of enormous poverty and distress. We don't want people from other countries coming in and telling us how to do our business, how to solve our problems. We would resent that greatly. And it seems to me that to some degree, our interference in the affairs of other countries in the Middle East has elicited hostilities that has actually made matters worse, not better.
all right, last question, because we're going to have to wrap up.
Let me actually make a point of that, if I could, because I think it's an important one. Look, I think Andrew makes some very good points in challenging notions of whether we should or should not have intervened. That's actually not the question before us, though. The question is, what should we do now? We are where we are. And again, we can certainly talk about what we might have learned in those bigger issues about that. And I'm also, clearly we should be doing nation building at home, without question. Again, that we have discussed the various issues that need to be addressed. Again, the question, though, is do you still care about these other situations and the possibilities? Because again, we're talking about how do you end endless wars if you do? And one of my ideas would be that, maybe you recognize that you're going to have to stay engaged in these endless wars. Again, noting that we are where we are, and going back to 1980 and revisiting some of that stuff is actually not the topic before us. 2,500 troops in Iraq would not be ornamental by any means if they can draw on close air support, precision airstrike, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets. These are advise and assist teams. Again, remember that the way the Islamic State as an army was defeated and the caliphate in Iraq was eliminated, same in Syria, was with the Iraqis doing the fighting on the front lines. The Iraqis this time did the reconciliation, the restoration of basic services, damaged infrastructure repair, and all this rest of that. What we provided was enablers for them that are absolutely crucial, and they do not have. And again, it also includes the ability to fuse intelligence. But if you have advise and assist teams, you have a very modest footprint, you have enough force protection, because there's also an issue with Iran, which is trying to Lebanonize Iraq. It wants to have the kind of muscle on the street that Hezbollah provides it in Lebanon, and it wants to have the muscle in the parliament that it has in Beirut, and it's working to that. That's not in our interest, I would submit, either. It may not be, again, a vital interest, but I think it's a pretty important interest. And Iraq, by the way, doesn't see that as in its interest. The prime minister, the president, others are very clear. Right. So again, I don't know what the right number of troops is in Iraq, because you'd have to do a pretty detailed troop to task analysis of what it is that you are trying to do, what the Iraqis want us to do. And I've had conversations recently with some Iraqi leaders about how they would like us to continue to enable them to go after the Islamic State now and its insurgent and terrorist elements, and also to help them to counter the Iranian-supported Shia militias that are so challenging for them as well. That's an issue about, again, just doing numbers. 2,500 is not a trivial number if you deploy them, as I mentioned, with the enablers that you have from outside the country and bases that are quite secure.
Thank you. Francis, 30 seconds or more. One final comment.
Just very briefly, the question, we're seeing a lot of skepticism in the questions that are coming through, understandably, on our ability as the US in general to fundamentally remake foreign societies, remake their governments. I understand that entirely. And I think this goes beyond just our major investments in places like Iraq and Afghanistan to a host of other conflict-affected and fragile states around the world where we're doing sort of smaller scale stabilization efforts. I understand that entirely. In my view, going forward, a key criterion for whether we engage in any form should be, do we have a partner on the other side who wants our assistance, who has a shared vision for, be it reform, better governance, et cetera? We can't bring in enough technical assistance or military assistance to make up for the appetite on the host government partner side to have that kind of aid. So I'd like us going forward to be much more discerning on that question up front.
Can I just add a final, since I had to deal with a lot of these partners firsthand, you don't get the partners that you want. You are in it, and you have to deal with the partners that you are dealt. And they are imperfect, just as I'm sure they see us as imperfect. And it's about trying to make the best of a situation. Again, I am very cognizant of the lesson, again, that I think Andrew rightly raises about being very, very cautious in what it is that we do. But again, what we've been discussing here is the endless wars that are currently ongoing and where we are currently involved and what we do about them. And again, the fact that you don't have a perfect partner, you know, it never seemed to me that that was something I could write back to or call the president and say, look, this guy isn't all that we hoped he would be. We ought to give it up or something like that. Again, these are the realities with which you have to deal. Certainly, you should think very, very long and hard before you get into these kinds of situations. And again, I think Andrew makes some very valid points about that.
You know, I knew we couldn't in an hour. We're now 8 minutes over an hour deal with both of these subjects. Partly it was my fault. We took on an enormous challenge, but I have to say, it was an incredibly rich, thought-provoking, and I would argue masterful set of presentations by all of you. And I'm sorry when we went over, but I want to thank the three of you for a terrific discussion. And I hope our viewers and listeners stayed with us. So with that, thank you so much. Until the next session of Carnegie Connect.
Thanks
for including me.
Andrew.